Welcome back. You're listening to Ask the CIO, sponsored by Thundercat Technology and NetApp on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Ken Rogers, the acting deputy CIO of Business Management and Planning at the State Department. Now, Ken, before break, you started talking about acquisition, which is one of my favorite topics, and you started talking about, you answered a couple of my questions about the strategy around potential cloud and kind of how you guys are looking at going forward. And you mentioned a few other things, building a cadre of IT acquisition professionals. You talked about optimizing vehicles. Can you maybe go into that a little bit more about what your thought process is and where you are today, maybe where you want to go?
Sure. So as I mentioned, in order to do IT well, and deliver that as a service requires leveraging acquisitions and optimizing how we do acquisitions at the department. And again, like our IT, our acquisitions for IT has been decentralized. So one of the first things that happened in FY17 is the senior leadership required the CIO shop to review and approve all IT acquisitions for the department. And so this was no easy feat because this was launched in about this time last year, a couple months before the end of the fiscal year. And so the last 2 months of fiscal year 18, we processed about 1,200 acquisitions for IT in the last 2 months of the fiscal year that required a whole new review process from the Office of CIO. That it actually worked. We didn't constrain resources getting out the door and programs getting funded, and continued into the next fiscal year. And the administration has continued that new governance process over acquisitions into FY18.
Let me jump in because I got to interrupt you on this.
Okay.
1,200 in 2 months. Is this all coming down on your office? Because as you said, you don't implement. You're the planner, the strategy guy.
Absolutely.
And did you have to hire people? Did you bring in contractor help? Because I think a lot of CIO shops are facing this exact same thing.
It would have been nice if we could have at the end of the fiscal year, but the timing required us to step up and make it happen, and that's what we did. But so we've gone the full year. We're approaching the tsunami at the end of the fiscal year, and so one of the lessons learned from this is the last quarter of the fiscal year represents 75% of our acquisition action. So when you think of doing acquisition strategically or optimizing that process, how do you break that up over quarters so you can have a more thoughtful process, more deliberate process with a workload distributed over the 4 quarters of the fiscal year? And so that's one of the things that we're looking at. Second is how do I take what was thrust upon us in FY17 and automate that, incorporate that into our acquisition system, and move that review process earlier into the acquisition lifecycle. So we're looking at that. So one of the major tenets is optimizing of our acquisition strategy is optimizing the way in which we review IT acquisitions, making sure they align to an IT investment in our eGov process that we report out to OMB and the IT dashboard, and make sure that there is an acquisition strategy, a part of those investments that really articulate what they're doing. Hey, these are in line. They're part of an investment. That investment's healthy, and we're making the right decisions going forward. So that review process is critical, optimizing that. And then once we really get that workflow down, automating as much of that as we can, so it punches out those at-risk investments that we can do greater due diligence on. Second area is then as we're looking at vehicles, one of the organizations in my side of the house is strategic sourcing. We focus primarily on enterprise license agreements, and we have a number of those in place for some of our core systems. So how do I expand that? And one of the visibility that we have received at the end of that we got from the end of the fiscal year 17 and throughout this year is there are a lot of software buys that we do, one off here, there, multiple organization buying the same software. So how do we accelerate our enterprise licensing agreement and get some economies of scale with those and eliminate some of the friction across the department in leveraging that software capability. So that's been successful. It creates cost savings. Can I push that out to buying hardware if we have standards in place, and then leveraging some of the cost savings with enterprise agreements that go beyond software.
And hopefully you can stop buying the software if that cloud strategy comes
Absolutely.
into play too, because you'll need less and less, if you will, the servers, the stuff that used to be in the data center, the routers, the switches, and the like. And additionally, the way the laptops and desktops are happening nowadays, and tablets, those refreshes don't seem to happen as often as they once did. At least that's the way my perception is.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, but there's still a requirement to buy, hardware, refresh and so
Printers,
forth.
there's always going to be that need.
So, but it brings in another issue to bear, is that supply chain. And we absolutely have to get our arms around that from a government-wide perspective. We all have the same issue, and of making sure we're getting equipment that we can put onto our environments and leverage it, knowing that the supply chain is secure and bringing us the right products that we can leverage. It makes absolutely no sense for every agency across the federal government to have to validate purchases or equipment that's being bought off contract and build their own supply chain analysis, or at least 80%, do the 80-20 rule. So you can do that at the agency level with a smaller lift. So how do we bake that into vehicles so that we, in some of the ways that DoD has done with their supply chain, working with industry to make that kind of thing happen.
In fact, I just did an interview with the folks at the Defense Logistics Agency about their supply chain. Fascinating interview, I'll say so myself. So I will recommend that to our listeners who are interested in supply chain. It's one of the most fascinating and hottest topics going around. One other thing about acquisition, let me just bring us back around to, is when you talk about automating acquisition, the automating process. I'm not sure how far along you are into it, but is it there are certain things that every acquisition must go through that you can say, okay, can we get, well, here's the buzzword, machine learning, AI, to kind of step in and do that, and then only flags when there's a potential issue or problem, or Ken Rogers just has to get that last sign off. But if the machine tells me everything else is right, I can do a quick look and then hit the approve button and move on. Is that the sense?
Yeah, the latter. How do we optimize that decision-making process? If you've met all this criteria, your procurement is approved based on the standards expected of an IT acquisition. One of the kind of a third area of our IT acquisition modernization effort is the acquisition an IT acquisition, yes or no? And if yes, do I have the right language in that acquisition that allows me to see what is being spent, bought, how, security, all the stuff baked in? If it's not, then can we put a clause into a vehicle that says IT is not allowable on this contract? So a lot of what happens, which decreases our visibility in what's being purchased, is when software or hardware is bought through ODCs, other direct costs, on a vehicle that's a services contract, not identified as IT. So we lose visibility, and this isn't Big Brother watching. It is you can't measure, you can't manage what you can't measure, you can't measure what you can't see. So let's know what we have, know what we're using, and manage that in a way that lowers our costs over time. And that gets into the whole FATARA Megabyte Act and software monitoring. We know what for the most part, we have good records of what we have, but how do I manage that usage, that next tier, to strengthen our position with how we're using resources for software? But to your point, a lot of this changes as we move to the cloud and pay by the drink, and do that central service offering of cloud.
This could take us down a whole path of IoT, interconnected devices, because when you buy a refrigerator, that's not typically IT, but that has IT in it now. Or when you buy office furniture, if that office furniture is some kind of standing desk, I'm making it up, right? I mean, all of a sudden IT is integrated in everything. So I imagine almost everything is probably going to have some IT in it. but I'm going to take us down a different path instead.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that over the 2017 and 2018, the State Department and the CIO's office has really looked at, okay, where are we now and where do we need to go? And you mentioned cloud, multi-cloud as one spot, one area of focus. What are some other things that came up during that review? You guys also did a survey of the State Department and asked how are we doing? So maybe start there.
So the survey that we did in FY17 really focused on asking a set of questions about modernizing, redesigning, and modernizing the Department of State. We had approximately 35,000 respondees from across the state. These are foreign service, civil service, domestic, overseas. Great response. And one of the top issues that came out was identifying some of the weakness of how IT is being done, delivered, and the ability to utilize modern technology. As a result of that, there were a number of other issues that came out of it. Acquisitions, one of those. We're not trying to bite off the whole acquisition apple, just focusing on IT acquisition, but focusing on the IT piece. There, as a result of the survey and a listening tour of a couple hundred, interviews with employees across the department, we identified a set of redesign initiatives around 3 core areas: simplifying access into the systems, collaboration, and then improving governance, so that improving IT governance so that we can move towards modernization in a more agile way. And from that redesign effort, a number of flagship initiatives, projects resulted from that, which really define out our 18, 19, and 20 IT kind of early quick wins of IT modernization, all of which has been rolled into an update to our IT strategic plan, which will hopefully be finalized at the end of this month. We're currently going through a department-wide review of that, and we'll be presenting the final for senior leadership to approve, so that it will provide the department, the bureaus, IRM as well, a set of goals and objectives with some pretty aggressive IT modernization, benchmark goals that we hope to achieve. So I can pause there if you have a few questions on that, and then I can go into what is in the new IT strategic plan coming forward.
So instead, we're going to take a break and leave a
Okay.
cliffhanger and make sure the audience comes back to hear what's in the IT strategic plan. So we're going to take a quick break. My guest is Ken Rogers, the Acting Deputy CIO of Business Management and Planning at the State Department. I'm Jason Miller, and you're listening to Ask the CIO, sponsored by Thundercat Technology and NetApp on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.